Caesar by Colleen McCullough, book review. Right, so this is actually the fifth book in a series. Series is called Masters of Rome by Colleen McCullough. Why am I starting at the fifth book? Well, the reason is the four previous books I had read when I was a teenager back in the 1990s, long before I started blogging or doing YouTube videos. So there are four books before this one. The Fortune's Favorite. Sorry. First one is The First Man in Rome, The Grass Crown, Fortune's Favorite, and Caesar's Women. I discovered these books when I was in high school. So The First Man in Rome, The Grass Crown, and Fortune's Favorites I read in high school. Caesar's Women came out right when I was a freshman at college. It came out in, I believe, 1996, 1997. So I read that book my freshman year at college. And then Caesar came out the year later. But you know, it's funny how quickly interests change when you're young. In 1997, I was still very much interested in ancient history. A year later, I decided I wasn't interested in ancient history so much. I was interested in more kind of modern history, and I completely kind of changed my reading list. And so I never got around to reading Caesar when it came out. I was talking with some friends one night, and somehow this series came out. One of these were like me; these were other history geeks. One of them was just starting to read the series. One of them had not read the series at all, and I was like, "Oh, guys, this series is amazing! I learned so much, and she gives such a vivid portrait of these characters, and blah 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 blah." And then, you know. And then, of course, I had to confess that I didn't read past book 4 myself. So after that, I went to the library and I decided to make up for lost time the books I hadn't read in the series. So went back to number 5, book Caesar here. Excuse me. Yeah. I guess maybe let me talk about this series as a whole first. So this series as a whole is called the Masters of Rome series. It starts way back when with Marius and Sulla. So Marius and Sulla are kind of the first two main books. And these tend to be long books. I forget the page numbers exactly, but I think the first couple books especially are about 1,000 pages. Some of the subsequent books I think are a little bit shorter, but they're all well over like 500 pages. They're kind of in the range of getting close to 1,000 pages, all of them. So yeah, the first two books is about the rivalry between Marius and Sulla. And Julius Caesar, and kind of the generation of Julius Caesar, like Cicero and Pompey and Cato and kind of all the other people who will be famous during the age of Julius Caesar, are all portrayed as kind of kids growing up during this time. So I believe, if memory serves right, Caesar was born at the end of the first book. And then you see him as kind of like a child in the second book. And then, of course, by the third book, he starts out as a teenager and then kind of transforms into a young man. The fourth book, kind of Caesar is a young man, and then this fifth book, Caesar, he's now we're getting into the period of civil wars. For historical fiction, the kind of sweep is just epic. And I guess I should make this disclaimer. I really like historical fiction. For me, like, this is the best way to learn history, because I get a little bit bored. I'm a history nerd, but I have limited patience for kind of slogging through, the original Plutarch or something like that. But, you know, if you can make it into like a modern sounding novel with, you know, like characters and dialogue and stuff like that, then I just love hearing these stories. And, you know, to think that all these amazing things that happened were actually true, yeah, I really get sucked into it. I know not everybody does. I have friends who don't like historical novels because, you know, they say it really bugs them not knowing which part is fiction and which part is history. I can see that a little bit, although I always kind of, after I finish reading a historical novel, I always enjoy going to the Wikipedia or whatever to kind of check what was true and what wasn't. So for me, that's kind of all part of the fun. Anyways, this series, the early books in it talk about kind of Marius and Sulla, which is, yeah. On the one hand, I remember when I was in high school, and I knew who Sulla was because he had popped up in my Roman history class as kind of the first Roman who had marched on Rome, or kind of successfully marched his army into Rome, I guess, not counting like Collianus or something. But I had no idea who Gaius Marius was, and the focus of most of the first two books was on Gaius Marius. And anything kind of unfamiliar always takes a little bit to get into. You're like, who is this guy? Why should I care? Like, I knew who Julius Caesar was, so when Julius Caesar was born at the end of the first book, I'm like, okay, now I'm getting into some familiar territory. But for like a lot of that book, it was just, I wasn't quite sure who these characters were. So if you're like me, if you're kind of attracted by what's familiar, then those first kind of couple of books, you've got that barrier going up against. But if you flip that around and you say, okay, because I know nothing about this, it's that much more interesting. You know, what's unfamiliar is more interesting. Then those first couple of books are really something. Because there's not a lot written about Gaius Marius and Sulla, at least not at the popular market level. You know, I know, like, if you go to a university, there's all this scholarly literature about them. And I know if you go back to the ancient sources, they're in Appian and Plutarch and stuff like that. But in terms of just like a armchair history, either like a historical fiction or just like a popular history that you could pick up in a Barnes & Noble bookstore or something like that, there's just not that much stuff written on Marius and Sulla. So to this day, I think most of the information I know about Marius and Sulla kind of comes from these books. And then as you kind of move forward in time, you're getting into the period of Roman history, which I think I'm not wrong here in saying this is a period of Roman history that's the most written about. Kind of the age right before the end of the Republic, with Caesar and Cicero and Cato and Pompey and all those people living then. We've got a number of ancient sources on it. We've got like a number of primary sources on it. Cicero's letters have survived. Julius Caesar himself wrote a couple books about it. A number of other ancient historians wrote about this. So we've just got so much information on this period as these series kind of moves up through time. Which, yeah, has both pros and cons. The obvious pro is just we know these characters so well. We know about the squabbles between Caesar and Cato. We know about the different parliamentary maneuvers that they were able to use in the Roman Senate to kind of block motions, and how the tribune of plebs was able to veto motions, and all these kind of political maneuverings they did. We know about the political parties which were on hand. The disadvantage is arguably, we know this a little bit too well, so you kind of go into these stories kind of already knowing what's going to happen, right? You pick up the historical novel and you're like, yeah, I know Caesar's going to cross the Rubicon. I know his army's going to fight Pompey. I know he's going to win. You kind of know what's going to happen already, and yet there's a certain pleasure in just kind of seeing how the novelist is going to unfold events, which I kind of enjoyed. The other disadvantage, though, is that there is too much information to include in one book. And Colleen McCullough talks about this in her afterword. She said, yeah, there was just too much stuff, and my publishers wouldn't let me write 3,000 pages. So I just had to cut out stuff. In the early books, of course, that wasn't a problem. So she was able to kind of put in all these details about Marius and Sulla. She was also able to write about kind of the whole Roman world at the time, kind of what was happening over in Spain, what was happening in kind of Pontus. With these books, she has to narrow her focus a lot more. Anyways, I've been rambling for a while. I'm just going to kind of read from the book reviewer I wrote at the... Sorry, I'm going to read from the book review that I wrote at the time after reading this. So, when I was going through my classical history phase, I read a lot of historical fiction. I read Flames of Rome by Paul Meyer, I, Claudius by Robert Graves, Julian by Gore Vidal, etc. But McCullough Series was always my favorite. In part, all those other books I was just mentioning focused on imperial Rome. McCullough focuses on republican Rome. And I found that much more interesting because when the emperor's in charge, there's just one guy in charge. And so you just kind of write about his ego. But during the Republican period, there are just so many different egos clashing in the Senate. And there's all these sneaky political maneuvering that they use. And McAuliffe makes full use of this. One reviewer said of her, I forget who this was, but I read this quote somewhere. Her characters could easily walk into Washington, D.C. today. Now, the last 50 years of the Republic, which is the focus of McCullough Series, is the most interesting part of Roman history. Partly because so many things were happening, and the Republic was falling apart at the seams, so it was terrible, but it was interesting. But also because so many legends occupied the world stage at the same time. I mean, think about it. We've got Julius Caesar, Augustus Caesar, Pompey, Crassus, Cleopatra, Mark Antony, Cicero, Cato, Brutus. All of these characters are in this one novel here. They're all in the novel Caesar. Now, given how many gaps there are in world history, it's also amazing how much we know about this period even 2,000 years later. McCullough Series is, to the best of my knowledge, the most thorough historical fiction account of the last years of the Roman Republic. And yet, even she has to severely cut and choose what she focuses on, as she herself admits in her afterword. Caesar, by Colleen McCullough, covers the Gallic Wars, the civil war between Caesar and Pompey, the various political intrigues in Rome. Each of these could have been a whole book in itself. Each of these probably could have been several books in itself. So here, more so than in her other books, the editor's hand is very evident. I was particularly disappointed that Claudius Publius and his reign of gang warfare was cut out. I became interested in Claudius Publius actually because of Colleen McCullough's previous book, Caesar's Woman, in which she kind of sets up Claudius's story very nicely. We get to know who Claudius is one of the most interesting people in Roman history. Not one of the best people, but one of the most interesting people. So we get to know all about Claudius in the previous book, Caesar's Women. And it seems like Colleen McCullough is kind of setting it up for his story to take center stage in the next book. And I was taking a course on Roman history shortly after this at college. And you could choose what your research paper would be on. And I chose to write it on the organized gang warfare between Claudius and Milo in the late Republic. In large part, because Colleen McCullough had gotten me so interested about his character in the previous book. So, in this book, I thought Claudius was really going to come to the forefront. There's a story to tell of the gang violence increasing, Claudius getting out of control, Claudius beginning to intimidate Pompey, Pompey and Crassus kind of looking to set up Milo as a counterweight to Claudius. All of that should have been in this book, but there was no room for it. So it happened between books. When this book starts out, the gang warfare between Claudius and Milo is already established, and there's a brief flashback which kind of recounts the stuff that got left out between the books. But I was really disappointed. I was looking forward to kind of seeing that part play out in the novel. But, you know, that's the trouble with us history geeks. You know, it's like those Harry Potter fans who are always complaining about everything that gets left out of the Harry Potter movies. Us history geeks are like that with the historical novel. We always complain about all the parts that get left out. In spite of that complaining, there are a number of things that the book does do well. So even though Claudius's kind of rise to a gang leader gets cut out, Claudius' death scene gets treated very thoroughly. And then the trial of Milo was given good treatment in the novel. Also, in Claudius's gang was Curio and Mark Antony. And kind of the evolution from both of them to kind of Claudius's gang members to kind of serious political players in their own right was nicely done. The one nitpick I have on this, my impression based on what I was reading, is that both Curio and Mark Antony had drifted away from Claudius before his death. What Colleen McCullough portrays in her book is that Mark Antony and Curio are kind of part of Claudius's gang up until his death. I think that's wrong, but like somebody let me know in the comments if you know better. Another thing I thought that came through nice in this novel was Quintus Cicero. Now, Quintus Cicero is Cicero's younger brother, who was on Caesar's staff in Gaul. And I've seen this pop up in a number of histories. They mention in passing that Quintus Cicero was with Caesar. And I think Quintus Cicero had, what was it? He was, at one point he got besieged by forces. He had to call for Caesar for help. Or there was something notable that he did during the Gallic Wars that kind of always pops up in the histories. But I never got kind of any explanation of like Quintus Cicero as a person. Because here he was, he's Cicero's brother, and Cicero and Caesar did not get along. They were political rivals. So he's Cicero's brother, but yet he's serving with Caesar. So how are his loyalties divided? Colleen McCullough, even though it's a historical novel and not a real history, does, I think, a good job of focusing in on this character and giving him an appropriate amount of time to talk about him as a man torn between his family on one hand and his political loyalties. Now, as in any good book, a number of these characters come into their own, and they seem to live lives outside the printed page, which is essential in historical fiction because these characters were actually living at one point. So Cato, the character of Cato, comes off perfectly as the self-righteous moral ideologue who could walk into any of today's conservative organizations. In fact, one of the prominent conservative organizations in Washington, D.C. is actually named after him, the Cato Institute. You get the impression from Colleen McCullough's books that Cato would be right at home in the Cato Institute. Cicero is a bloated windbag with a spine of jelly, but portrayed in vivid terms. He really kind of leaps off the page. Mark Antony is great as a young Hale type character. It's young Hale as a reference to Shakespeare's King Henry series. So somebody who has had an irresponsible extended adolescence, but he's now beginning to take on more serious political responsibilities. Now, I wrote at the time that I thought, yeah, I'm not sure I entirely agree with myself here, actually, but I wrote at the time, see, the thing is, Colleen McCullough was, at the point she was writing these novels, she was a middle-aged lady. And I wrote at the time that I thought a lot of these characters kind of came off sounding like gossipy middle-aged ladies. And I thought, well, maybe McCullough is just kind of putting too much of herself into the book. I'm looking at that now and I'm thinking, boy, that was kind of a sexist thing to write. As if, like, 50-year-old women couldn't write believable characters. But you do, I don't know, the characters do kind of come off sounding very gossipy and catty sometimes in the letters. Paraphrasing slightly here, but this is kind of the tone. My dear Caesar, you simply won't believe what is happening in Rome. Why, everyone is rolling over the latest gossip concerning Cato. I don't know. Yeah, it could be maybe because Colleen McCullough is Australian, and maybe the Australian English is sounding a little bit different to my American ears. I don't know. I thought it didn't really sound like things these characters would say some of the times. Also, there's a lot of big words in this book. Now, when I was in high school, the first two books of this series, I actually used to bring this huge dictionary with me to read these books. So I had swim team practice after school, and we had to wait until the other team got done using the pool. So we couldn't get in the pool until 5 o'clock. So from 3 o'clock to 5 o'clock, we just sat around kind of doing homework or reading. And I would have Colleen McCullough's Master of Rome series with me. And then I'd have a huge Webster's Dictionary, which I would actually lug around in my backpack so I could go through and check all the words. I think partly that's because I was just young, 14, 15. I don't actually need to bring the Webster's Dictionary along with me now. I can make sense of all the words in the book, but there are a lot of literary words in the dialogue which do sound a bit strange. It's like people maybe write that way, but they don't talk that way. I don't know. And yeah, then the insults that the characters are yelling at each other sounds really unnatural. They say things like, I shit on your prick. I fart up your hairy nostrils. Which, nobody really says that kind of stuff unless, given how thoroughly these books have been researched, I wouldn't be surprised if Colleen McCullough has uncovered kind of something that, this is how the ancients actually talk. This is like a translation from a Latin insult. Yeah, I don't know. She usually kind of explains this kind of stuff in her afterword, and there was nothing about it in her afterword. But I don't know. Maybe it's authentic from the way the Romans really used to talk. But it does sound incredibly unnatural to me when I was reading the book. Okay, few more complaints. The character of young Octavius, the character who's going to grow up to become Augustus Caesar in the future book, in this book, he's just a child. And he's absolutely terrible, meaning that the character that Colleen McCullough has written is not believable. Now, I think child prodigies are hard characters for authors to write because they have to come off both as believable as children, but they also have to kind of have adult-like qualities of being prodigies. But that being said, Colleen McCullough completely blows it. It's not her strength. Way back at the beginning of this series, the parts featuring Julius Caesar as a child, and kind of in the first two books, were pretty bad as well, if memory serves. But I think these passages with young Octavius are even worse. Now, as for the character of Julius Caesar, he comes off a bit larger than life for my taste in these books. He's extremely confident in his success, and everyone who meets him is just awed by him, and they conclude he can do no wrong. Now, of course, with the benefit of hindsight, we now know that Caesar achieved amazing things in his life, kind of won countless wars, not countless wars, but he won a lot of battles against overwhelming odds. But that's with hindsight. When in a novel, you've got to imagine that these characters are actually living their lives at the time. And when they're living their lives at the time, they don't have the benefit of knowing what's coming. So I thought it was a bit kind of spoiling things to make Caesar larger than life. I mean, sure, we know that Caesar actually accomplished a lot, but I think you have to portray him while he's doing it. Kind of while the action is taking place, you've got to create some suspense and be like, would Caesar actually pull this off? Nobody actually knew. Instead of portraying like Caesar is so confident that he's going to win every time. There's also some foreshadowing in this book, which I could have done without. Felt like it ruined the suspense. I mean, even though the history is a matter of public record, I like the illusion of suspense when I'm reading a historical novel. So, for example, Cato. Cato was saying that he feels in his bones that he's not going to outlive Caesar. I don't know. Maybe this does come from like Plutarch or something. Maybe it's in the historical record. But I thought Cato didn't really think that. That's just kind of hindsight being rewritten in. Okay, now to talk about the political bias of these novels. So this novel and all the ones before it have a very pro-Caesar bent. And if you go back further to the books containing Gaius Marius, I guess they have a pro-populare bent. Populare was a political faction which both Gaius Marius and Caesar belonged to. So the populares are always portrayed as the good guys. The aristocrats or the optimates are always portrayed as kind of the bad guys. Now I'm going to just kind of quote from Wikipedia's analysis of this series. Wikipedia says, "The series has a thesis. As Rome became more powerful within the Mediterranean world, the old ways of doing things, though through deliberation of various interests, mainly aristocratic and mercantile, became impossibly cumbersome. It became more and more difficult to govern an empire with institutions originally designed to administer a city-state. Certain wise leaders, such as Marius and his nephew Caesar, tried to reform the old ways, and to do so in a manner that would be consistent with Rome's basic character as a republic. But the conservatives, called the optimates by classical historians, though they themselves preferred the title boni, or good men, opposed reform so fiercely that they made inevitable the death of the republic they claimed to cherish. The result was the birth of an imperial monarchy and a radically different organization of power." So that's Wikipedia kind of attributing this thesis to Colleen McCullough's books. I think it's overstating it a little bit to kind of reduce these whole books down to a political statement. I mean, yes, that bias is there. But more than anything, Colleen McCullough is just having fun reimagining ancient Rome. Which is why she takes so many digressions on narratives that have nothing to do with her thesis. She's a history nerd. She's interested in history for history's sake. But to the extent these books have a political bias, I think that kind of does fairly accurately reflect it. Yes. So in my estimation, Caesar is kind of like a Napoleon figure. So both Caesar and Napoleon instituted much needed reforms and kind of much needed liberal reforms, arguably. But they also did so at the expense of abolishing democratic institutions, which, just for the record, I think is bad. I don't want to defend Caesar or Napoleon. But because there are these two sides to their characters, you could kind of portray Caesar or Napoleon as a dictator, or you could portray them as kind of a benevolent liberal